Hey everyone, it's Dilantics, and today I'm going to be doing an explanation and meta prediction for patch 14.1 of TFT. I'm going to cover all the game changes, the buffs and nerfs, and then I'm going to take a look at what the last meta looked like and how this patch might shake it out. All of the patch information is from Mortdog's patch 14.1 rundown video on YouTube or on Twitch. His rundowns give a little bit of insight into why they make these decisions as developers, so definitely check that out. Without further ado, let's go. Alright, let's start off with the systems changes. First off, looking at headliners. So to understand this change, you have to know how pool sizes work in TFT. Basically what a pool size is that every cost has a certain amount of copies of a unit in a pool, and once that pool is depleted, once someone gets that last unit, you're no longer able to get any units of that kind until everyone who's holding that unit dies. So if I'm playing MF reroll and someone has 9 MFs and MF3 and someone else has 8 MFs, I'm not going to be able to get any MFs until either of those players dies, and then once they die, those units get released back into the pool. So how this headliner rule worked before was that if there were half or more of the units out of the pool, you could no longer hit a headliner. So if someone was at 6 ribbons and they were looking for a headliner ribbon to get that ribbon 3 and get those bonus traits on ribbon, they wouldn't actually be able to hit if the total pool size left of ribbons was over a half, so half of 17 would be 9. This made it so that players could hold extra copies of the units on the bench to deny players who are rolling for them, because the player rolling for them would no longer be able to hit them as a headliner, so this led to some extreme ratting technology. There's also a case where you're rolling for an Ahri and you're in a really good spot for Ahri, but you can't really play anything else since your items are too flexible. Maybe you already slammed blue buff, Dasher's Gunblade, Ionic Spark, so you don't really want to use that blue buff for an 80 board since you have that spark. So the pool size for 4 costs is 10, and so before this rule change, if there were 5 or more Ahris out of the pool, you wouldn't be able to hit anymore. But after this rule change, you can hit as long as there are 3 left in the pool, although it'll be pretty unlikely. You can still hit that Ahri headliner. Additionally, 1, 2, and 3 costs no longer have any sort of restrictions on pool size, but 4 and 5 costs have restrictions, but they're only based on what you have. So it says own more than 4 copies of a champ. So if I have 5 copies of Ahri, I can no longer hit a headliner Ahri and get that 3-star pretty quickly. But if I have 4 copies of Ahri without that headliner, I can still hit. Same thing applies for 5 costs, but it's only 3. So I think it's a really good change to combat a lot of the frustrations players are having with other people holding their headliners and not being able to hit a certain headliner. And just a good change to an honestly sort of hidden rule that exists about headliners. And I'm going to be making some short form content explaining some more hidden rules about headliners, like why streamers buy and sell headliners that have certain traits. So be on the lookout for that. Alright, streaks. This is a big one. So if you didn't play the last patch, a ton of players, especially in higher elo, were open hoarding, basically selling off their units in stage 2 because of streaks. Unless you hit another player who's full open, you would be able to guarantee a 5 loss streak, which is just a lot of gold because of how these streaks worked before. So to combat player frustration and this strategy, they're releasing this next pair of changes. Instead of being able to 2 streak, you now have to hit a 3 streak, and then a 5 streak for the next gold threshold, and then finally a 6 streak. So those 5 streaks are not nearly as important as they used to be, because before this change, you'd want to 5 streak into Krugs because you get that streak gold on the neutral, whereas now you only get 2 gold into neutrals, and you get 2 gold on that neutral round, which decreases snowballing a bit and decreases the reliance on having that streak. They're additionally reworking the combat ties. This is basically what happens when a full open player hits another full open player. So now they both lose and their streak gets fully reset. No more complaining about traveling because you guys both lose out, you both lose your streak. Do I think this is enough to stop open hoarding? You're still gonna see it every once in a while, but yeah, I think this is enough to take it out of being the predominant strategy, which is a very, very good thing. Finally, an emblem adjustment. So they're swapping out the craftability of the Jazz emblem and giving it to country. So now you can make a country spat and go for country 7 with a spat and a cloak, and Jazz is taken out. They're nerfing country a bit, which I'll talk about later in the trait section, to compensate for this. This change is also important because we're getting some portals that add spatulas to the game. So portals are the selections at the start of the game that replace the opening carousel. It's still going to be 3 selections of portals that people vote for, but now they're adding some spicy ones. Some portals are returning from set 9 just with a different name. I'm going to be making a video and slideshow covering every portal in the game, including these new ones. It'll have all of the information of each portals and what they do, any loot tables that apply to the portal, and some strategies to maximize the portals. All of the new portals are listed on this page, so pause and read through it if you'd like, but I'm going to go to the next section. Alright, moving into traits. Starting off with 8-bit, we have the 80 per stack increased by 0.5 at 2 8-bit, 1.5 at 4, and finally 2 at 6 8-bit. and a reminder that 8-bit stacks up to 10. Now this change is pretty interesting to me because I think Riven is already pretty strong, Caitlyn is already really good, although she's incredibly broken with true damage spat, which is catching a nerf, thank goodness. We'll talk about that later. They're buffing the trait overall and nerfing some of the units like Caitlyn and Corki because of just how strong they are for their headliners and in general. But Garen is getting a buff and Riven feels strong already and isn't getting any nerfs. So I think this will push Riven to the forefront along with the other nerfs to other comps. 6 8-bit, if you're putting Riven reroll and put it on Viego, was already really strong, so I'm pretty scared about that one too. Alright, Crowd Diver. So Crowd Diver gets a buff at 2 Crowd Diver and a nerf at 6 Crowd Diver. This makes sense to me. Crowd Diver 2 didn't really do anything, whereas Crowd Diver 6 was really strong. I don't expect this to have too much of a change in the meta. It'll make playing an early Crowd Diver or a Crowd Diver headliner solo feel a lot better. It's also a buff to comps that only play 2 Crowd Diver, like Edgelord Yone instead of Crowd Diver Yone, or maybe a Zed carry comp. Speaking of Zed, EDM is getting some changes. So the base spell power of EDM is getting buffed at 2 and 5, but the frequency is getting nerfed at only 1 second of a frequency reduction at 5. Additionally, Jax's frequency for his ability being copied is reduced by 1 second as well. So I think these are pretty sizable nerfs to EDM 5 and the Jax reroll comp, given that having 1 second off that frequency reduction is a lot more casts. You know, it could mean only 2 casts instead of 3 casts, or 3 casts instead of 4 in a fight, which is a pretty big difference considering how much damage those EDM casts do, especially at EDM 5. Alright, Emo. Emo is getting another buff this patch. So it's getting a mana reduction buff at 4 and 6, and then also a mana and ally death at 2, 4, and 6 buff. The 6-piece AP bonus is getting a nerf to compensate for that huge mana reduction. This is a solid change. A ton of people were playing 2 Emo, and not a lot of people were playing 4 Emo or Emo as a vertical in general. What I will say is that 4 Emo with Annie if you had a blue buff is already really strong, and these changes make it even better, so I'd be on the lookout for that. Alright, Executioner. This is an interesting one. So they're reducing the base critical strike damage at 4 and 6, but then they're increasing the max critical strike chance at 2, 4, and 6 by a huge amount. So how Executioner works is that you get that base critical strike bonus damage, but you also get crit chance based on the target's missing health up to 100. And how it works with TFT is that any excess critical strike chance that you have gets converted into critical strike damage at a 2-to-1 ratio. So if you have 200% crit strike chance from Executioner and Infinity Edge, that extra 100 is going to be converted to 50% extra damage. So I really like this change. The Executioner vertical wasn't being played at all since they don't really have much of a match together except for Vex Twitch and Akali Karthus, those pairs. So I'm excited to see if anyone cooks up some new vertical Executioner comps with this. And this is also giving power to the Karthus Akali comps, Samira a little bit, and Vex and Twitch by a good amount. So I'd be on the lookout for those, especially that Vex Twitch reroll. Guardian gets a decent buff to the 4 and 6 breakpoints. Not much to talk about here. Guardian at 4 wasn't very good. No one was really playing it, especially when you compare it to 6 Sentinel, which everyone was playing. So good to see this change. I'm interested to see if any comps lean towards 4 Guardian now. For instance, Annie might play 4 Guardian for Emo. Punk already plays 4 Guardian, so that gets a buff. But yeah, I don't expect too many changes from this. Heartsteel. Oh boy. So Heartsteel gets a mini rework. So after the 4 rounds that you cash out, you have the option to either cash out like normal, and this resets your heart counter, or you can raise the stakes. So how this works is that after you raise the stakes, your box turns gold, and then you go on a huge streak. So during the raise the stakes mode, you gain double the hearts that you get normally, but if you ever win a round, your hearts get cut in half and you immediately cash out and go back to 0 hearts. So this is that risk reward playstyle we saw in other sets like Fortune and Piltover. But the caveat is that to get max value, you have to cash out at those 4 breakpoints, which is honestly really hard. You really want to make it to that 8th or 12th lost breakpoint where you die and you're able to cash out Heartsteel, because if you win on accident after that, or you're too low, so you have to win the next round or you die before cashing out that Heartsteel, you lose a lot of stacks. I tested out on PvE, and honestly, the numbers are pretty low for the amount of loot you get for the hearts for losing so many rounds in a row, even with this raise the stakes mode, so I'm not too worried about it, but I think we'll see some banger content from it. In addition to this, Heartsteel at 5 and 7 get a nerf, which is very well welcome. A lot of people high rollers were getting Heartsteel 5 in, and that trait is really broken considering how strong the units are right now. Hyperpop. Hyperpop gets a buff at all of its breakpoints. Pretty good change. I wasn't really seeing anyone playing Hyperpop in the last meta. Lulu reroll was okay at best. Ziggs was a trait bot and applier of his shred effects and the dazzler effect, which is honestly still pretty good, but he's getting a damage buff, so I expect a resurgence of Ziggs. Jazz gets a buff after it got hit really hard in the previous patches. And remember that this goes along with the Jazz pet being removed. So for Jazz, you either have to have an elusive emblem or you have a headliner Lucian or MF or Bard. We'll see if there's enough to bring back MF reroll to the front lines. I think that MF is already pretty decent. Not amazing, but pretty alright. But buffing Jazz is always scary since it's so splashable to set. Sentinel. So Sentinel 6 and 8 Sentinel catch a nerf. The thing is that it's only a 5 MR and armor nerf at 6 Sentinel, which is what's carrying the 6 Sentinel RA comp. And basically the devs want the RA comp to be lightly hit, but still in line with the other comps in the meta. That's their hope for this change. Honestly, I think it should have been nerfed more. And Sentinel 8 gets a big nerf. This is probably because of the new portals that give a toe. Spellweaver. So 10 Spellweaver got reduced to 9. This makes sense because you needed 2 elusive emblems to hit Spellweaver, even with the Chosen. Spellweaver 7 gets a buff. No one was really playing 7 Spellweaver to much of success. If you did, you're probably playing any reroll, and if you made it to 9, you're already top forward. With that reduction in the 9-piece Spellweaver, it's getting a big nerf to AP per cast. Once again, with the increased availability of emblems, makes sense. Small trait changes, as I was saying, emblems are going to be more common because of those new portals, so 10 KDA, 10 pentakill, and 9 true damage are all catching some nerfs. Fair enough. Country, because of that spatula change, is getting nerfs as well. I honestly think this isn't enough. Country 7, in my experience, is already pretty strong, so we'll see how good it is because I think it's a little too good for only needing 1 spatula. KDA gets a slight HP and AP nerf at 3 and a buff at 7. The vertical KDA comp wasn't nearly as good as 6 Sentinel RE, so the buff to 7 makes sense. And then the 3 KDA was really good in Sentinel RE, so it's catching a nerf. Fair enough. Finally, the Superfan Ziggs item got changed from Arcade Tools to Sphere of Shojin. Makes sense. Access to mana items on a Ziggs is really good. Although with the headliner changes last patch, it's pretty hard to hit a headliner at Ziggs anyway, so this will probably not affect most of your games. Alright, let's get started with the champions. There's a bunch, so I'm gonna make it quick. So first off, Annie gets a base spell damage buff, but her empowered, which happens after her 4th cast, she loses a bit of the attack speed buff and a lot of the empowered fireball damage, which is the fireball that hits the second target. So the main target, the single target damage, is higher, but the splash damage is lower. This isn't intended to be a buff to 2-cost item holder Annie. The attack speed and the empowered fireball changes outweigh the buff to the spell damage, but I don't think it's too much of a hit. Nami. This unit sucks near the game compared to the other ones, so she's getting a decent buff to her mana and her headliner as well, we'll see later. But the stun duration is getting lowered, which makes sense. Olaf is getting a 580 buff and a slight attack speed buff. I watched Setsuko go 8th twice with Olaf yesterday, so I'm not a believer in the comp yet. We'll see if this changes anything. I'm not sure. Maybe if you have too big to fail, which I think is going to be broken on this patch. Speaking of too big to fail and bruisers, Tom Kench gets an 80 buff and a 5 armor and MR buff. That 80 buff does not matter really, we're not going to see 80 Lickitung, but the armor and MR buff does help. Tarek, this unit also sucks, and he's getting a huge buff to the spell damage, but that doesn't really do anything because honestly, you never notice his spell damage. How it works is that his next 2 autos after he casts get bonus damage, but that guy does no damage. That guy is still going to do no damage. I don't think this does anything. Violet from Arcane Season 2. She is back on the patch list with another buff to the surprise of no one. She's getting a lot of base spell 80% and a lot of empowered spell 80%. Some pretty sizable buffs to Vi, which makes sense. That unit does nothing right now. So this helps out the Punk comp because that's really the only comp playing Vi. 6 Mosher has so many better options. And since Punk gives you so much AD, this might actually make Vi a unit. Corki was the best headliner AD carry and in general unit by far, so an AD nerf makes total sense, especially since his headliner bonus gave him direct AD stats. Similarly, with those strong headliners, Cassante was the strongest tank and gets a slight nerf to the spell damage reduction. I think he's still going to be really good. Same with Corki. The reason is because they're already really powerful and these nerfs aren't huge, and their traits are just really good, especially if you're a headliner. Evelyn is gaining some more attack speed on cast. Evelyn reroll is not good right now. I don't think this is enough to bring it back in, but it'll make her a strong unit in the early game to item carry or play in the side, especially with that big 2 crowd diver buff. Also a slight buff to the KDA vertical. Speaking of KDA vertical, Lilia is getting a mana buff. She takes 10 less mana to cast. Makes sense, she wasn't casting that much, so this helps a little bit. 2 costs, so Bard is getting a big change. He gets buffed to his damage at all stages, but he also will always cast 3 damage notes and a healing in any sort of order, so it's not like it's going to always be damage, 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 healing. It's in any order, and he can still print out 1 gold. It's just a really, really small chance. This makes it so, you know, if you're relying on Bard as an item holder to deal damage, or even like a solo carry, he won't randomly heal your Nami 1 twice when he's supposed to be one-shotting the backline. So I like this change a lot. That's Just Baby, even though it got hit a ton, is still above 0.5, and I think Bard reroll with these changes will be really strong if you hit that augment. Gragas gets even more spell damage on his ability. He got this buff last patch as well, and he wasn't really doing any damage. We're seeing a lot of these bruisers get buffed damage-wise, so I think that Too Big to Fail augment is going to be even scarier, and it's already really strong. Also, notice how the 3 disco units got buffed. You know, I don't think these changes will push Disco Dazzler over the top. However, the changes coming up soon might, so stay tuned. Garen's getting a 50 HP buff and more HP per gain on cast. Another buff to 8-bit and Sentinel, which is pretty scary to me. I think 8-bit's going to be really strong, and 6 Sentinel didn't get hit hard enough to knock it out of the meta. Kaisa gets some pretty welcome buffs. Her spell 80% gets buffed, and her spell AP damage also gets buffed, that base damage on it. Kaisa reroll is very niche. Usually it happens when you're contested on MF reroll and you fail to hit it. We'll see if this and those 4 big shot changes from earlier can push it over the edge into being a playable comp. I think she's already a pretty good item holder, and this will make her even better. Twitch is getting a spell 80 buff, but he gets less explosions on his ultimate. So this is meant to be a buff towards Punk, especially 4 Punk or 6 Punk. 6 Punk is already really strong because you need an emblem, but 4 Punk, this is a buff towards that because Punk gives you AD and health. I'm pretty sure this is an overall slight buff if you know, especially the more you roll, it's for sure a buff. The later you are in the game, the more you use your rolls, the more you get that Punk bonus up. I think the Twin Terror Twitch comp is already really good, and it's going to be really scary to fight that next patch. As for Punk Twitch, we saw Vi getting a buff, we see Twitch getting a slight buff, and we see Pantheon getting a buff now. Again, the Twin Terror comp is way better, but Punk gets some buffs too. Pantheon, as I said, more damage reduction on his AP. This basically means that Crown Guard is even more broken on him, which it was already his one. Katarina gets a small attack speed buff. Pretty good buff. We haven't seen Katarina do well in a long time. This is coupled along with the 2 crowd ever buff, but also with that 6 crowd ever nerf. So she'll probably be a bit of a better item holder now. I don't think this will bring back Katarina reroll into the meta. Last but not least, for 2 costs, Kayle is getting another buff. Honestly, I think Kayle is already good enough, so this might push her over the edge. She's getting more damage on her auto attacks, and then her spell finale, which is the end of her auto attack buff, is getting a lot more damage. So I think Kayle is going to be pretty scary. China already really values her, especially as a 2-cost headliner, so we'll see where this goes. Alright, 3-cost champs, large changes. Echo is getting his stun duration removed. In the video, Mortdog talked about why Echo even has a stun when he has 3 amazing traits. Honestly, I agree with that. Echo's kit is overloaded, and this is a step in the right direction. Honestly, I would not miss it if they just removed the stun. Lux gets a damage buff at 2, and Lux gets a damage buff at 1 and 2. Makes sense, makes Lux a bit of a better item holder. I'm really glad they didn't buff 3-star Lux because that unit is scary. That is some scary stuff. Mordekaiser. So Mordekaiser is getting a damage buff on his ability. Honestly, that guy does a good amount of damage, and we're seeing some pinnacle buffs later on, and this is a buff mostly to that Mordekaiser Chosen or Headliner because his Headliner bonus gives him stacking AP. Lulu's getting a small spell damage buff, but this is also in tandem with those hyperpop buffs, so keep that in mind. Lulu was okay at best. She's a pretty good item holder, especially for Ahri, but as a reroll comp, she was alright. So we'll see if this pushes her into reroll territory. Honestly, I think it's going to be a pretty good option for AP reroll. Misfortune. Ooh, so Misfortune and Bard both get a buff for that Jazz comp, as well as Jazz the trait overall. So MF is going to get 10 AD at 1 and 2 star, and then a 15 AD buff at 3 star. Pretty good buff for MF, considering the bonus damage from... I think this is enough, especially with That's Jazz Baby, to put her back in. Finally, Nico gets a tiny buff. Not much to say here. She gets a small nerf from that KDA 3 trait nerf, so fair enough. everyone's favorite cost, 4. Starting with Ari. Ari gets a slight nerf to her attack speed. This is basically a cast nerf. The way her ability works is that she has to cast once to do the charm and then cast a second time and so on to get that nuclear damage going. So this slows that a bit down, especially since she's building Shojin or blue buff plus Nashor's Tooth every game. Definitely not enough to push her out of the meta, not at all. TF. So TF is getting the attack speed per card. The 40 to 20% kind of looks like a nerf, but what it means is that you only need 20% to get a bonus card rather than 40. Up to, I think it's 21 is what Mortdog said. TF's getting a slight buff. He was already decently strong. I feel like TF was at a stage where if you high rolled, you would win the lobby, but if you didn't, you'd probably end up at 5th or 6th in the strong lobby. So we'll see how much TF can reduce opponents' life points in this next patch. Karthus and Viego, both of the Pinnacle Warriors, are getting some changes. Let's start off with Karthus. Karthus has less starting mana, and his ability is getting changed to hit only 4 targets instead of 5, but it deals a lot more damage to those targets. This change is pretty interesting, but is better for his traits since Executioner, is going to give more damage to that added spell damage, and Pentakill will get those kills faster for Karthus rather than, ulting a 5th target. The 5th target by then is probably a tank or a pretty healthy unit, so you're not going to get much value to that, or you're not going to be proccing Pentakill off that. So this makes sense of the change. Viego, this guy was mid at best. He needed an AD buff. Honestly, I really did not believe in this guy last patch as a solo carry. You definitely needed a duo carry, and I always thought like he was meant to have a duo carry, right? With the way his ability works, it gives damage. It marks people for more damage. So yeah, this is a good buff. Small changes. Caitlyn gets a tiny nerf. Thankfully, the true damage spat is catching a nerf. But 8-bit is getting a buff, so this is to sort of balance out that buff. How Mortdog explained in the video is that they want AD Flex, Caitlyn, Ari to still be on top of the meta, but to bring up some other comps in line. Poopy or Poppy gets a small HP heal nerf. Poppy got a pretty good buff last patch, and honestly, I didn't even know she had this HP heal on her ability. I'm a TFT player, so I don't read. So yeah, whatever. Thresh gets a 50 HP buff, keeping in line with the Sentinels. Note that this buff is along the lines of the 4 and 6 Guardian buff, which also scales with HP, so pretty good buff too, Thresh. As for the country comp, I think you're still gonna go for a Mimic 3 and put items on him, but this helps out a little bit. Alright, 5 costs, Bill Gates, the legendaries. So, Lucian, the big thing, the bug fix is finally here. So his spell was bugged where it wouldn't scale with attack speed, but now it is fixed. So if you have 5 attack speed, you're going to see him fire a ton of shots, which is awesome. I think his ability cast is one of the coolest in the game. So I'm excited to see that. He's also getting a slight buff to his AD and spell AD. I think these changes are going to push him to be really good and more than just a trait bot or applier for Sona's attack speed. Speaking of Sona, the healing form and damage forms are getting buffed, and the attack speed forms are getting nerfed. Totally makes sense. Attack speed form was way better than the other two, and the other two were pretty much unplayable. Honestly, that's a pretty big nerf to attack speed, so I'm not sure what will happen with Sona. I assume it's still going to be attack speed, but we'll see if people start running healing again. Healing was super OP on PvE, and I'm sure they won't want to see that again. Kiana, this is a solid nerf. Really like this change. Kiana only prints 1 extra item for cast, 2 stars. So she's still going to print a lot of items for your team for that 1 round, but it is a really good nerf. Additionally, so whenever Kiana attacks someone without an item, they take a bunch of extra true damage and get knocked back. This is a pretty big nerf to that extra damage. Solid nerfs to Kiana. I still think she's going to be really good, especially, that item copy effect and the damage is way too good. All right, Ziggs is back. He's getting an attack speed buff, making him cast more, and a bunch of damage on his small bomb. This is definitely enough of a buff to push him back into being a primary damage dealer. He was already really good as a trait bot, a dazzler bot, a shred bot, so now he's even better. And combined with the TF buffs, I think Disco TF is back on the menu. Although it never really left the menu, but it was one of those that you didn't really want. Kind of like the Arby's of TFT. It's still food. Editor Dylan here, they added a last minute nerf to Dazzler's damage reduction by 5%. This is a really good preventive change, but I still think these units are going to be really strong. Alright, last of all for the units, we've got headlander bonuses. 1 cost, Evelyn, Olaf, TK, Tarek, Vi, and Yasville are all getting some changes. Buffs for the first 4. Yeah, these guys were pretty bad. Vi is getting more HP, less AD. That'll help her survivability in the early game because she is a frontliner and she's getting more shot. Yasuo is interesting. He gets more HP and less Omnivamp, so you're pretty incentivized to build Omnivamp on him, whether it's Hodge, BT, Death's Dance. Aphelios' headliner is getting a slight buff. Honestly, I'm surprised by this, given that he's a hard steal. Garen's HP for the headliner is getting a slight nerf, but he's getting a pretty good buff overall. I still think Garen headliner is going to be good. Nar's jump is slightly delayed to after the initial enemy targeting, which is great. Me and my brother were talking about this, how if you're playing headliner carry Nar, your dude would jump in and immediately die because he get targeted by 20 people. So this is to prevent that from happening. Nice change. I mean, Nar reroll is a playable comp, but it's not meta defining. Gragas, along with that damage buff, gets more damage on the headliner. I've seen a lot of buffs to this guy to try to get this guy to deal damage, so we'll see if we can get bomb in action. Nico now gives an extra 20 mana to her ally, which is a really interesting change. Remember that her ally that gets the mana is the highest HP ally, so it's not going to be a carry. You're not giving like Ari another 40 mana, that'd be broken. But if your highest HP is something like Thresh, this is pretty good. Zachary gets a buff as well as a headliner buff. Honestly, that's a lot of HP, especially if you have 6 bruiser. Again, too big to fail, really strong. Kane headliner, you know, you're not going to hit this guy until level 10 unless you're a filthy high roller, but you gain 10 more AP in the Shadow Assassin form. Okay, let's talk augments. Bulk is getting a nerf at all 3 types. Yeah, this augment needed a big nerf. Good. Like to see it, especially with 6 Sentinel. Oh man, good stuff. Is it still going to be good? Yeah, of course, man. It's bulk. It's a cyber. But this brings it more in line with the other HP augments. Know that Three's a Crowd also just got a nerf on the most recent B patch as well. Best Friends 1. So Silver Best Friends getting an attack speed and armor buff. Yeah, this augment was pretty trash. Makes sense. Consistency is gone. This all or nothing tuber augment is completely gone because of those streak changes, because consistency just doubles your streak gold. It doesn't give you like extra gold like inconsistency or switching gears did. So that means this augment sucks because you need a 3 streak for that one, 5 for 2, 6 for 3. It's just not good at all. So it's gone. Bye-bye. I wasn't taking you anyway. Help is on the way. This augment was pretty busted, especially if you're playing weak early game or full open. It came way too early compared to stationary support. So yeah, welcome nerf. It's had like a 4.2, 4.3. Note that 8 turns means 8 player combats. So this is after the carousel. Stationary support gets the same nerf to 8. That augment was also way too good. And now they're all standardized at 8. So that's pretty cool. Rolling for Days gets a slight buff with one more reroll. This augment wasn't that good. Now it goes from 16 gold to 18 gold, which is pretty good. Also, it can now show up on 4-2. Draven patch, anyone? Onto gold augments. Crash Test Dummies. This augment is still broken after all the nerfs they've gone to it. And it's still probably going to be broken. The stun gets nerfed down to a solid 1.25 seconds from 2. 2 seconds was absurd. The jump is delayed slightly as well, so if it's in the backline, your front line is actually going to take damage before they jump in. If they're in your front line, I don't think anything's going to change. Exposed weakness. So it's down to 30%. Yeah, 40% is way too high, down to the standard 30%, just like Even Shroud, Last Whisper, Spark. And the execution comps are going to be pretty good with those buffs, so makes total sense. Extended Play, which is the Punk augment, you get more gold now. Good change, and yet another buff to Punk. This augment was not that good for a Punk themed augment, so yeah, makes sense. Heroic Grab Bag gives more gold. You didn't really want to be taking Heroic Grab Bag. If you did, that probably means your spot sucked. More gold makes sense. Little Buddies gets a solid, pretty big nerf. So it's 15 health per buddy. If you have 4 little buddies, that's 60 health per unit nerfed. Aligned with the bulk nerf and the Three's Crowd nerf, this augment was way too good. Even when you'd play it and you drop a bunch of little buddies in the late game, it was still really, really good. It's way too many stats on it, so this is a welcome nerf. Ramping Rhythm. This augment is straight trash. Glad to see it buffed. Is it gonna be good? Nah, I don't think so. Return on Investment gets a buff to only 16 rerolls instead of 18. This augment was already, it was really bad or really good in certain spots. So this buff is pretty good. I think it'll make those high roll spots even better. Submit to the Pit. So this gets a slight rework. How it worked before is that your monsters would gain stats based on the adjacent allies at the time. So if you had 6 allies around a dude and then the allies moved during the fight, then you'd no longer get that bonus. So now it's just based on at the start of the fight, just like keepers or any, AoE effects from back in the day. This makes a lot of sense. The stats are getting nerfed 2-3 per, but honestly, this makes it a lot more consistent since, you know, units in TFT often tend to spread out a line. So I think this is an overall neutral change or even a buff. Finally, 3's a crowd, cannot catch a break, gets another nerf. Honestly, deserved. It's still at like a 4.1, 4.2 even after getting 2 nerfs in a row. So interesting to see that they're nerfing all of the HP augments. And honestly, with interactions with items and traits like Steadfast Heart, Guardian, Bruiser, and Sentinel, it honestly makes sense. For schematics, binary changes is just text. But Tiniest Titan gets 7 more gold on 3-2. Yeah, this augment was not good on 3-2. Still probably not gonna be that good. But, you know, if you're going for that hard still cash out, there you go. More money. Items. This is a lot of reading, and you know what TFT players don't do? You guessed it. Adaptive Helm. So, buffs to both the front and back row. Wow, okay. Honestly, I didn't think this item was that bad. I'm surprised to see it get these buffs. These are pretty decent buffs. This is also indirectly a buff to that fully adapted augment, which is not very good. So that part I get, but yeah, interested to see these buffs. I think these kind of come from a complaint about the cloak item, which honestly, the cloak item is not that bad. You know, even Shroud is really good, which also got a buff. Don't know what that's about. Anyway, Archangel Staff. So Archangel's dual gauntlets and Rabadons all get a buff, which is pretty interesting to me. It makes sense. Rod was pretty bad. Like, Rod was definitely the worst component. I think it's worse than Cloak. A lot of buffs to AP comps, so I think AP is gonna have a takeover this patch. 5 more AP for every 5 seconds. Radiant gets a buff too. Makes sense. Archangel was like decent, not very good. Bloodthirster, BT diff. Now it gets 15 AP. It's not as much as the AD gets, but slight buff to stuff like Jax and Kane, who like that AD, AP, and healing. And all of the Bloodthirster users have some sort of built-in AP ratio. All units in the game do. So, slight buff to the BT item. Blue buff. Slight nerf to blue buff. This item was broken. It was way too good compared to Shojin. On Ari, on Ezreal, on pretty much everyone who wanted mana. So I'm a fan of this nerf, especially given how important it was to get 2 tiers in the last meta. Hopefully this brings it in line with Shojin a little more. Still think it's gonna be good though. Dragon's Claw. Declaw gets a pretty solid buff, buffing the cloak again. Honestly, Declaw in a probably AP meta, good buff. What I don't get is this Even Shroud buff. This item was already really good. What I will say is that some people haven't picked up on it. Something that some people haven't picked up on is that you can put Even Shroud on your melee carries like Viego, Akali, even Kiana, and it's still pretty good. This is a buff to that as well, giving them some more survivability. Note that that bonus MR and armor is only for the first 10 seconds of combat. This item was already good. It's even better now. Okay. Gargoyles. Gargoyle now gives an additional 100 HP. This item got gutted because of the advent of multicasters. Oh, please don't remind me. It got nerfed beyond belief. It was a terrible item, worst in the game, unironically, no exaggeration. And then it got buffed last patch, and it catches a buff again. I think it's gonna be pretty good now. I loved positioning around Gargoyle in previous sets, so I'm glad to see it back. Gunblade gets more AD and AP. I guess it's to make more champions than Ahri use it. Kinda scary change, but yet another buff to Ahri. Ionic Spark now gets another 200 HP, so I guess they really want. Right now the meta is to put those shred items on your main tank. Right now the meta is to put those shred items on your main tank, so I guess they want some more survivability for those shred items, which makes sense. You know, it makes the fights a lot less snowbally if those shred items stay up more. Especially in like a mirror matchup. If you kill the tank with a shred first, then you're probably gonna win the fight. Jewel Gauntlet gets a slight buff to its AP. This item was not very good. I mean, it was great on Jax and Lux, but mostly for the crit effects. I don't know. I think it's a pretty decent option, but that new death cap is going to be even scarier. I was kind of hoping it was the next one on the list, but it's Morello. Morello now gives 50% attack speed, which makes sense. It helps you get those casts off more. Honestly, Morello doesn't have too many appliers to set. Some of the obvious ones are Ziggs, TF if you're not carrying him. Vex is really good at it if you're not carrying Vex, or if you are and just it's a pretty good item. But yeah, Morello has not been dominant in this meta like it has been before with like stuff like Lissandra. Since Morello doesn't apply on auto attacks like Rebuff does and only applies on ability casts, this is a good way to buff it. So Death Cap gets a little less AP, but like in League, you get a ton of bonus damage. This is a really interesting and fun change. I'm excited to see this in action, but this is a pretty good buff. Red buff gets even more nerfs, deserved. This item is way too good. Honestly, still gonna be pretty good. The Radiant one gets a lot of nerfs too. The Radiant was one of the best items, if not the best item in the game. Makes sense. This item is still gonna be really good. The attack speed, the damage, and the heal cut, way too good. Radiant Crown Guard, Steadfast Heart, get buffs, don't care, great. Finally, true damage emblem. You made a mistake in the headliner video. Now true damage emblem does not give the bling bonus anymore. It is gone, which is a great change. No more TD Caitlyn 720 no scopes. We're back to 360 now. Finally, bug fixes. Endless hordes will no longer delete. Oh, I had this in my game once. I was so mad. Glad to see that's fixed. The other ones I haven't really seen. Oh, that Abyssal Mask one has been in the game for forever, so that's nice. But the biggest one that was mentioned earlier is that the Lucian attack speed bug is fixed. Nice. Alright, meta. Let's talk meta. Last patch was decently flexible with a focus on 4-cost headliner carries. The high stability of headliners meant many players were playing full open to econ up and rolling down to stabilize on 3-5 or 4-1. The top 4-cost comps were Sentinel Ahri and Ezreal Caitlyn Flex, with TF being decent, and for rerolls we had Jax, Riven, Yone, and Twin Terror Twitch, with Country and Annie rerolls popping off here and there. Since there weren't many nerfs, all of these comps are still going to be really strong in the new patch, so if you'd like to learn out of position to play them at their full potential, check out my latest video. Meta predictions. First, I want to talk about those streak changes because strategy changes are huge. Full open got a lot weaker and is actually dead if you fight another full open player. Additionally, nerfing true damage spat also made the strategy weaker since full open players would always go for it with their first carousel pick. Importantly, the streak changes also make the game have a lot less gold in it, especially since these changes don't just apply to stage 2, they're for the whole game. We might see more players level to 3-1 to get that 6 streak, and I expect a full return to playing your strongest board, which is a welcome change. Hearthstone 5 got nerfed, but it's still great to put in if you hit it. I'd say don't click that raise the stakes button, but hey, 90% of gamblers quit before they win. Also, if you're playing on one of the new for fun portals, just scratch everything I just said, your game is screwed anyway. Less gold in the game is usually indicative of a reroll meta, since those comps stabilize faster and use less gold than 4 costs. I don't expect it to be a full reroll meta, but honestly, we're headed in that direction. While reroll sucks when you're contested, the headliner changes actually help a lot with that problem since the unit pool rule is gone. This makes you a lot more likely to hit a headliner if you're contested, considering it was oftentimes impossible before. While you're still probably going to place lower because you're contested, your spot is a lot less doomed because of this change. Which brings me to my number 1 forcible comp for the patch, Riven reroll. Riven was already really strong and got buffs through 8-bit, Garen, and even the AP on Bloodthirster. Its worst matchup, 6 Sentinels, also got a slight nerf. I think this comp will be on top, especially if you hit 6 8-bit, which will be even easier to get with the new portals. Right next to Riven is where I put Twin Terror Twitch reroll, Tongue Twister. This comp was already really good and got even better with the Executioner buff. I think this is actually the best comp on the patch, but it requires that you have Twin Terror, where Riven reroll is pretty forcible. I'm going to make either a short or a full video guide on this comp, so be on the lookout for that. For 4 costs, I expect TF to be on top, with Pentakill and others not too far behind. I think the TF, Ziggs, and AP add-on buffs are definitely enough to push him up there. Same applies for Executioner Karthus Akali, which I think will come back, but won't be as good as TF. You know what that means. Get out your tentacles. Other than that, I think the meta will be pretty similar comp-wise to the last patch. The most notable nerfs are Jax reroll and True Damage Spat, which will still be good but not overpowered. And who knows, we might even see a Kayle takeover. That's a wrap for today's video. This was really long. Are you like asleep or something? I mean, I've definitely been there. I just want to say thank you all for the support so much on the recent videos. Y'all the best, no Capapine. We did just hit 1,000 subs, which is super cool because now I can get spoils of war from YouTube. Draven patch anyone? I'm still going to be making guides on this channel, but I'll also be making a lot of short form content starting with a new series, Teamfight Tech. Since people really like the Vegas video, I'm going to be sharing both simple and lesser known tricks, including headliner hidden rules and positioning tips. You can find me on TikTok, YouTube Shorts, and Instagram Reels. Bad. Thanks again for watching, hope you enjoyed the video, and clam on.